I am so happy to have you on, Mr. Eduardo Martinez. Thank you for taking your time out of your day to talk with me on the Blueprint for California Advocates podcast. I would love if you just did a brief introduction and let us know where you came out of and where you are.
And thanks for having me, Christina. I'm excited. I've seen a few episodes, or at least snippets of them, and I was kind of wondering when you were going to ask me. So I'm definitely glad to be on.
Nice.
My name is Eduardo Martinez. I'm the legislative director for the California Labor Federation. We represent around 2 million workers statewide across 1,200 affiliates. The voice for labor in the state, affiliated with the National AFL-CIO. I had maybe a bit of a different path to getting to this point. I've spent a good chunk of my 18 years now in politics and policy working for the legislature, right? Working for different members of the legislature, 5 members to be specific. Most recently had the great pleasure of serving as Assemblymember Todd Gloria's chief of staff when he was in the assembly, and now it's great to see him as mayor of the second largest city in California, 8th largest city in the country, doing really big things and frankly reorienting that city to focus on the plight of working families and workers. He is really just doing incredible things down there, and it's just such an honor to have even just a little small part of his success in getting there. So, but that said, I'm here. I'm happy to be at the Labor Fed too. Obviously, there's no shortage of issues and fights that we need to get into, particularly as we go into year 3 of the pandemic. So really great opportunity to really do some meaningful work on behalf of workers in California.
I formally recognize you as my labor brethren. And I can't even imagine, you started just about a year ago, right?
That's right. Yeah, I started, I think it was January 3rd, I think, of this year. So yeah, going on a year.
I can't even imagine what the last year has been like for you, acclimating to a whole new world, but not only a whole new content, but like the process still being completely insane. And
Yeah.
we're all making it up as we go, basically. Yeah.
Absolutely right. That's right. I mean, I think all of us, we all probably feel a little bit of uncertainty whenever we're starting a new job. You never really know, okay, what should I be doing? And so it takes a bit of time to kind of grow into it. You layer on top of that the fact that we're all still kind of working like this, right? As you can tell, I'm at home. I hope you appreciate the lovely kid. My family made this for me because they knew that I was kind of lamenting. My Zoom background was not very up to par, I think, for most of the years. So they spent a little time to help me out.
Right,
Yeah.
actually.
But it's challenging, right? It's challenging to do this work and to do it this way. The kind of the fundamental concept of labor is, that we come together for a common purpose. And in a lot of ways, we are literally not even able to come together. And so how do you, how do you coalesce around shared goals? How do you strategize to get different things done, given all of these limitations on advocates these days? It's been a challenge.
Right. Well, actually, so that's a great segue because I am very interested in your perspective as a former staffer and having such a deep experience of years in the legislature. So clearly a command of that process. And now being in the third house for the first time, what that has been like, probably been 100 times worse than it needed to be because of all of this COVID stuff. But just the general transition would always be, I imagine, a little bit challenging going from the building into the third house, just because, your perspective is completely different. You're facing a different, it's like the people you were facing across the table, you're flip-flopping with them. So your thoughts on like that transition, what that has been, and lessons learned or insight that you think other advocates would find helpful?
It's a great question. I guess I didn't necessarily appreciate how different this role would be, kind of thinking about it the way you said, where it's maybe a different side of the same coin. No, that is not
coin.
Totally different coin. That's right. I think, I guess maybe putting it all out there, we are all very busy, right? I think whether you're in the legislature, whether you're an advocate, there is just not enough time in the day to get all the things done that we'd like to. All of us probably start out with a to-do list in the morning that is kind of quickly scrapped as the day kind of goes on, and it feels that way. I think one of the things I've noticed that's really different is sort of when the critical thinking or sort of strategery kind of comes into play, depending on what side of the table you're at. As a staff person, you're really, most of the time when you're dealing with personal staff, like I was the chief of staff, you're really kind of expected to know a little bit about a lot of different things, but you don't get necessarily too deep into any one particular area because you can't afford to, because there's just not enough time to dig into that. You're meeting with groups across the spectrum on all kinds of issues that you didn't even know were an issue. And so you're having to just kind of take on all that incoming. And, so what you do is you meet and you hear people out, you try and ask pointed questions. And then afterwards, it's kind of where you do your thinking, okay, what did they say? Well, how do I need to use this? What do I need to relate to my boss, the elected official? How did what they came in to talk about, how does that inform our work? Where the advocates, I think it's totally reversed, right? It's a really effective advocacy meeting, ideally involves a lot of preparation on the front end. If you're going in with a group, let's say you have to come up with an agenda of what you're going to talk about. Of course, you should obviously ideally try and pregame the meeting as much as you can. Okay, Christina, you're going to kick us off, and then Bob over here, you're going to talk about your personal story, and then Mitch, you're going to get into the specifics of the ask or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a lot more for front end work, in addition to preparing all the materials that you want to leave with staff, which of course is really appreciated, because we have to review that, and a lot of times notes or memory isn't super reliable. So it's just I think among other things, I think that was sort of the really big differences.
From the perspective as a former staffer, are there tips or lessons you would impart around how you make your lobby visit as productive as possible? I'll ask super bluntly, right? How do you conduct a visit with a staff member where you are leaving that staff member impressed, actually connected to what you want them to do? My thing is always create the emotional connection right away, because otherwise people are gone, right? How do you position yourself during that meeting so that when you leave, that staffer is like, I am going to present this to my boss right away. I think we should do this. I'm on board, versus these people have no idea what they're doing. They are not resourced for this. They have good intentions, but I don't see this going anywhere. Or they're really just not prepared. And I don't think I should put my boss out on a limb for a group that I don't think knows what they're doing.
Frankly, kind of saw more of the second than I would say of the first, right?
Oh,
a
wow.
really well-run meeting where the takeaways were clear, the ask was apparent, and I think reasonable, let's say, and the delivery was in a way that somebody who again has to be everywhere was able to still sort of resonate. I would say, sort of going back to my last point, preparation is to me the most important thing. You can't just go in there and kind of wing it. You have to at least sketch out, how you want the meeting to go, particularly what objectives you're trying to have with the meeting. So if you're not super intentional and forthright about the objectives, I think there are some groups who maybe think, okay, well, the staff can kind of read between the lines a little bit of what we're, don't do that. We
don't
remember,
do that.
we just don't have the capacity to have a 30-minute debrief session with ourselves as we think about what you just said. We can't do that. There's another group right after you. And it's frankly a little worse now with Zooms. And so that's not necessarily the best way to be, take that info and digest it. So preparation is super key. I totally agree with you about the relating to a personal dynamic or telling a personal story, especially when you're talking to the staff, the personal staff of a member. Again, I think statistics and studies and things like that are good. I mean, you want to have some sort of foundational policy foundation, I think, to your arguments. But I find staff is typically going to be moved much more by what does this policy mean for somebody out there, right? The Capitol is often referred to as a fishbowl. And I think what people mean by that is we kind of operate in this little silo where we only kind of think about problems and issues as they present themselves in the Capitol in a political or policy context. Never mind the fact that these have real life implications to people all over the state. And without really crystallizing that through some concrete examples. Hey, because we didn't have a law like this, I was not able to do this, and it had all these bad outcomes, not just for me, but for society. And so we ought to look at changing it. Like that translation, again, don't assume that the staff can tie whatever policy you're pushing to the direct personal benefit, human benefit that it could have to people. So you really need to walk staff through that. And then, the last thing is, what is the ask, right? It ought to be meaningful. It ought to move the needle, in whatever fight you're in. But it should also be, mindful of the fact that the person you're asking to do this for you is busy. And so let's not ask for folks to get back to you like tomorrow or something, right? Or, later on the day, like you got to give people time to kind of run through their processes and vet what you're asking. Because I think the staff, among other things, we're all trained to be skeptical about everything that comes in. And so folks have to do the due diligence, that we have to allow people time for that. And so when you jam them, or you make, you ask for a crazy turnaround time or something like that, we just say, okay, well, that's not achievable. I'm going to move on. And I'm not actually even going to give their issue any more thought, because that just wasn't, it's just not respectful.
Yeah, it's not respectful. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is being clear what your ask is.
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes, of course. Right.
Yeah.
And particularly just laying this all out here. We'd like their support for the bill. We know your bill is not going to come up for some months. If she could give us an indication in a month or so, that would be helpful. Like, you know what I mean? Like, be real clear and put some metrics and put on your calendar or reminders to yourself when to follow back up with that staff person after you've already made those requests.
Yeah.
That was maybe that's another thing too, is that a lot of groups don't necessarily do well, is the follow-up. Sometimes, usually staff will ask you a question or two. Sometimes we don't have the answer necessarily readily at our fingertips. That's okay, but I think it is important to get back to them, right? Because that, again, another touch point opportunity, and it shows that you are being responsive.
And kicking it back up their inbox when they don't respond, and not taking it personally and thinking that they hate you or something,
Yeah, especially these days, it's hard to not take things personally like that. Like, I'm like, why aren't you getting back to me? Like, come on.
Yeah.
But it is, we got to be mindful. Not only do all of us have a ridiculous amount of work, we're still working in these kind of crazy conditions, right? Where we have family and, children and all of this other stuff intermixed with, trying to lead a professional life too. So, it's always just mindful that we're all going through our personal struggles that nobody on the outside has any clue about. And so to, always to be kind and be patient and, that, I think that's really important too.
Creating the relationship with the staff is just as important as the member, for sure. Right? Like,
absolutely.
You can't run without them. And they're the ones that make the recommendations. Sometimes you don't see the level of respect that should be happening, because people, especially people who are consider themselves important, feel like they're beyond that or whatever, which I think is just a bad move, because they'll always have their fingerprints on whatever it is you're trying to do.
I agree with that. Particularly, there are some legislators where, they may be sympathetic to your issue, but your issue is not necessarily their top priority issue. You're talking to somebody who's really big into transportation, and you're talking to them about childcare. It's not as if they don't care about childcare, but they just maybe don't necessarily, the legislator doesn't have necessarily a lot of brain power for that. But you get their staff person whose portfolio is a little smaller than the legislator. You can move some things when you have somebody who can really focus on this too. Most legislators, really depend on their staff. There's just too much coming at them too, that they just couldn't do it all by themselves. That's definitely time well spent, and not to be upset if, let's say, even if you have a meeting with the legislator and it gets moved to staff. That happens quite a bit, because committee hearings get called, meetings with the speaker, the caucus meetings, things like that. Be happy with that, because that's still time well spent.
You started a year ago. Was it shocking? Was it dramatic? Like, holy smokes, like, I didn't realize all that was happening before me. That, on a personal level, I'm just curious your take on flipping to the other side.
I want to know about, it was surprising, I think. I mean, you think you kind of know what you get into with making a jump like this, but one thing for me that was particularly eye-opening is you go from working for one member, of which I was kind of at the top of the staff ladder, to, like I said, working for 1,200 labor leaders. Like that is a huge change. And, you know, what used to count as consensus, which is essentially me getting approval from one guy,
Yeah.
I have to get approval from, I think our executive council is like 36 or something like that. And, you know,
Yeah.
that's not including all of the discussions and stuff that you need to do in preparation for that.
What you're saying is so resonating with me because in my own case where I went from being a union, labor lobbyist, where I did what you're doing, I mean, not the same, I didn't work for the Fed, but where you're basically hustling 24/7. There was no slow time. There was always a crisis. There's always attacks left, right, and center. And realizing now, even the third house, not all of it is created the same. It's the building the stuff that's the really hard part.
Yeah.
I'm only recently starting to grasp that just being there to advocate for things not to happen, what a big difference from being the one who's trying to create and build something. I don't know that folks understand how much work that is. Exactly what you said, how much prep time is in that.
If you and I were that kind of advocate, we wouldn't be in front of our computers on a Friday right now. We would be on a golf course somewhere, or we'd be going to a spa or something. Like there are lobbyists and advocates.
Right.
That's what, they don't work Fridays. Like why? I don't need to.
Right.
I just will wait to see what, progressive groups.
Right.
Yeah. And then that'll tell me what my workload is like. And, it's different, right? We're usually on the frame of pushing something, not necessarily having to stop something. Thank goodness for our legislative leadership and for our governor that we're in this, and frankly for the voters of California for electing progressive leaders.
Right.
We're fortunate. I hear a very different story, of course, from my counterparts across the country about what being in labor is like. No, it just seems very challenging, and especially when you have kind of rabidly anti-labor governors. I was talking to my brother in Florida, and what they're dealing with, COVID response, and not letting schools require masks, and so
it's bananas. I know
it is bananas. And so while folks in California drive me crazy too, I'm not going to deny that.
A different way, right? Yeah.
But it's always just important to kind of step back and reflect, like, things could be a lot worse. Workers are well positioned to get some wins, some additional wins next year.
Yep, that's right.
And we just have to thank our lucky stars. So I am trying to remind myself that fairly regularly.
So shifting perspectives, one of the things that I've always observed as a member of labor is that we could always do a better job uniting with other groups. There's so much more space to work together because there's more intersection than not. And, I at least now when I talk to organizations, I always say, well, who is the local union? Have you talked to the CLC? Have you reached out and introduce yourself? Who are you and what you're trying to do? And maybe there's potential for alliance. Maybe that union won't be open to conversation, and shame on them if they're not, but likely they will. And so that part of like building more broader alliances is something that I have always sort of observed as a shortcoming. I say this on both sides, like groups should reach out. How would you expect that to happen for the Fed? Like, or does this already happen where you're getting sort of these sort of inquiries?
It probably could happen more, to be honest. I mean, sure, we do. I think we feel like we have, not just in our direct members' interest, but this kind of broader mission to support particularly other progressive or kind of worker-centric related efforts, even if it's not brought up on behalf of one of our affiliates. But I agree with you. I think people maybe outside, other advocacy groups and the legislature, they think of labor as kind of one monolithic group. And frankly, we're not probably too dissimilar from the broader public. I think the intersectionality and trying to work on shared priorities or supporting each other in different areas, I mean, I think that's also really important too. And one thing we've been trying to stress, I'd say it's been a little challenging this year. Our unions are really focused on trying to recover from the pandemic.
Right.
And that seems to be priority number one. And I think probably rightfully so.
Yeah.
And so what that sometimes means is folks don't necessarily have the bandwidth or capacity to jump onto things, which they do support. But, they're trying to get their members back to work. They're trying to get them PPE or access to testing or vaccines or whatever. or, some employer is using the pandemic as an excuse to, do some terrible things. And
Right.
so we saw that quite a bit. And so, then saying, hey, well, there's this other thing that's also really important, sometimes it's just, again, because we're all overworked, overburdened,
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily land. But I hopefully, with the start of 2022 around the corner, we're hoping to get back to more of that, right? More of this, I would say, kind of good guy coalition, and do some good stuff, even if it's, not just, increasing labor's numbers or something like that. It doesn't have to be, exclusive
Oh
to that.
yeah,
Like,
I
how do we
always
help
found that
people?
to be the most bizarre claim. Like that actually is, I mean, of course that's a consideration, but that's not a driving, decision
No,
maker.
of course not. No,
Right.
and I particularly hear that kind of criticism from the legislature, like, why does labor care about this? They shouldn't care about this, right? This isn't about, wages or benefits or something like that. I'm like, guess what? We care about society as a
Our
whole,
members live in these communities. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm
Right.
sorry our engagement on an issue makes things a little more complicated for you, but you know what?
Yeah.
We wouldn't be doing our job if we just
That's
focused
right.
on, benefits, pay, working conditions, things like that. We got to do that for sure. But
Yeah,
there's other issues that we gotta that
that's
we
right.
want to be a part of. Yeah.
That's right. One last thing I would say on that, even if it's not coalescing around a campaign in 2022, I recommend for folks listening, and I'm sure you would agree, that it's also just relationship building, in that, again, you may not have work to do together, but like at least build trust and build familiarity, so that when the time does come to unite around an issue or a campaign, there's not like, who are you and do I trust you type of stuff, right?
Totally. I mean, I think that's kind of politics 101. You don't want your first interaction with somebody to be asking them to do something for you, right? Particularly something that maybe not is like squarely in their wheelhouse.
Yeah.
And so that's true whether, at least talking about me and my career, whatever side of the coin you're on there.
Yeah, that applies
Again, like
everywhere,
if you're
right?
asking some outside group to help your elected official with something, you want to have met them first, right? You
That's right.
want to have established
right.
some sort of rapport. And so if nothing else, to say, hey, we're interested in working with you on this. That other group says, I can't, we are at capacity. Okay, no big deal. You'll come back to them in 6 months or a year with
Mhm.
something else. And maybe then they'll have, they'll be able to do it.
Oh yeah, and let's grab
Yeah.
coffee.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Of
right,
course. Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
So actually, you just raised a great question, which is, as a staffer, and I try to promote this to the organizations I work with, is how do you go about building that relationship so that you're not just coming when you want the member to do something?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's probably particularly hard for the staff now, right? As they're sort of working remotely. The staff just moved into a new building across the street. And by all accounts, that's a little harder to do now because they're
Yeah,
working in these, they're
right.
kind of smaller pre-COVID design confines. And so it's harder to kind of have get to know you conversations. Maybe take a past example. So, I think in 2018, late 2018, my old boss, Todd, Gloria, decided, yes, I'm going to run for mayor in 2020. I want to do this. This is my shot. So obviously not on the state dime, would take breaks or do it on my lunch hours. But I thought, okay, what are the relationships that are going to be particularly helpful to help him achieve his goals, right? And there are especially labor, there were some relationships that I think that we needed to work on and really build and strengthen. And so kind of getting from them, what do you think, what do you see as the big issues coming in San Diego, for example, in the next 2 years? And how can we help or plug in with that?
Yeah,
I feel really good about working for the labor movement too, is
yeah,
we want to help people.
yeah.
How we do it, obviously within some parameters, of course, that's on you guys. And
Yeah.
what a great opportunity that is to do stuff like that.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, blessed. I particularly for my last two positions, just kind of having to, getting it to be able this creative space. It makes it challenging, right? Because sometimes you don't necessarily know where to go. You have a
And there's a
problem.
lot
You
more
don't know
work.
a lot more work. A lot more work. But when you deliver, when you're able to do it,
yeah.
wow, there's nothing more satisfying.
There's
right?
nothing better. There's nothing
Yeah.
better. Exactly.
Yeah.
When I think about why I do what I do, it's because of that. 100%. To know that you did something positive for some community, oh man, that's just amazing.
it's not for the golf outings, right? It's not for the spa days. It's not like we're,
I
you know,
like a
this is
spa
why,
day though.
yeah, we get paid the medium-sized bucks to try and figure this out, like how this all works,
Right,
and
right,
come
right.
up with solutions.
Last words of wisdom for the advocates listening.
You know, I just found, you know, sometimes it can be, I think, difficult, but I think one thing that I always try to remind myself is, as frustrating as advocacy can sometimes be, it's important that recognizing that we are the ones as advocates that need to meet them where they are, right? And what I've sometimes found is, you know, that may change how we communicate in the way, in the manner, and it's not necessarily the way that we want it, that you want to communicate, but we're not, you know, as advocates, we have to ask somebody else to do something on our behalf. And so I think it's always important to sort of meet them there. You know, sometimes what I've found, I think particularly for us, the Labor Federation, is most of the time, the most meaningful, impactful conversations that we have with elected officials are conversations that they don't necessarily want to have with us. And so how do you
Yeah,
impact them in
yeah.
a way that is cognizant of their busy schedules, cognizant of the fact that, you know, they don't got time to dig into a policy paper or things
Right,
like
right,
that.
right. That's not the
And
purpose of the conversation, right?
it's not, it's I have, you know, a 15-minute meeting. How can I meet you where you are
Yeah,
and leave something that resonates with you
yeah,
so that
yeah,
you will go do something on behalf of us?
yeah.
How do we connect with those folks in a way that that person you're talking to, whether it be elected or a staff person, hears it and receives it? Sometimes
100%.
it's got to change. You know, one meeting is one thing, or
Mhm.
one approach, another meeting is another. So there's some, you got to be nimble a little bit, but again, that's that connection. No amount of statistics, no amount of policy papers can ever make up for that connection when you're
That's
talking
right.
to a legislator or their personal staff.
That's 100%. Thank you for that. Prepare an elevator speech, to borrow from the business world.
Yeah.
Every advocate who is doing this should prepare for that 10-second interaction. What is the most important thing you want to convey, and what is the most impactful thing you want to convey, so that when that 10 seconds is done, like exactly what you said, you have left an impression that's positive and that person remembers you and wants to help you. 100%. Well, this has been super, Eduardo. I feel like we just hit really valuable areas. And dang, I wish this was available to me when I first started.
Oh gosh, yeah, I would say you're a bit of a natural, Christina. I don't know. You know, all of us have to find our kind of rhythm and our way to do it, right? And I probably there's even just different styles and tactics amongst advocates, but just being genuine, being
That's right.
sincere,
That's right.
following through, being honest when you don't know the answer. It's okay to say you don't know. I mean, all these things
Yes.
that your listeners probably already know.
Yeah.
But just be a human.
Yeah.
That kind of goes a long way too.
I like that a lot. Well, thank you. And I wish you and your family a super holiday.
Thank you, and thank you for doing these too. There is no shortage. I mean, we can never have enough advocates, and it's quite a big sacrifice to, particularly when we get back to in person, to make the trip to Sacramento, to
Yeah.
spend the time to research and do this stuff. So the
Yeah.
more folks that we can get recognizing that this is important, I think the better our process, our government will work. So
100%.
just thanks for doing your part, I think, to help get people to realize the importance of this. I think it really is critical.
Thank you.